She'll lose even her clothes, my son shouted across the blackjack table, his voice cutting through the room like a cracked whip. For a moment, even the dealer froze. Chips stilled midair, the rhythm of shuffling paused, and faces turned, curious, then embarrassed, the way people look when cruelty slips out too publicly to pretend it's a joke. He laughed, loud and brittle, a sound that didn't belong to the boy I once rocked to sleep, but to a man trying to humiliate someone smaller, someone safe. I smiled, the old, well-trained, automatic smile, the one I've used my whole life to soften other people's shame. But inside, something split cleanly, like ice underfoot. She'll lose even her clothes. That's what he said. And I realized, standing there under the casino lights that made everyone's skin look like a lie, that he hadn't meant the cards or the chips or even the game. He meant me. He always had. I am 81 years old now, though that night I felt both ancient and newly born, as if humiliation could strip a person back to raw beginning. I live above a liquor store on the edge of Reno, in a narrow apartment that smells faintly of citrus cleaner and last night's rain. From my window, I can see the neon shimmer of the casino district, that endless theater of hope and loss. Some nights, I still hear the faint chorus of slot machines through the wind, the metallic laughter of people convincing themselves that chance is mercy. I used to love that sound. My husband, long gone now, once said that casinos were built for people who needed to believe the world occasionally rewarded faith. It doesn't, I told him, but I still followed him there, just to watch him glow when he won a hand. It was our one harmless vice, our small rebellion against the slow erosion of ordinary life. I never imagined I'd return alone, not as a wife, not even as a visitor, but as a prop in my son's performance of generosity. Mark had called a week before my birthday, his voice all sugar and obligation. "You need a little fun, Mom. You've been cooped up too long. I'll fly you out to Reno. We'll make a weekend of it." I remember sitting by the phone, twisting the cord around my fingers, unsure whether to feel grateful or suspicious. Gratitude won, as it usually did with me. I said yes, of course, because I was raised in a time when a mother didn't refuse her child's invitations, even when she sensed the strings attached. He arrived with his wife, Jasmine, who wore her beauty like a polished weapon. Her perfume entered every room before she did. She greeted me with that bright, hollow warmth people reserve for customer service. "You look so spry," she said, as if complimenting a piece of furniture that hadn't collapsed yet. I smiled again, my old armor. That's what I do when I can't afford to bruise the air with truth. We drove from the airport in a rented convertible that smelled of plastic and bravado. Mark talked about business deals and market swings, things I once would have understood before numbers stopped being comfort and became confusion. He had that restless tone successful people adopt to disguise how empty they feel inside. Jasmine scrolled through her phone the entire ride, her nails like small, expensive knives tapping the screen. I watched the desert unfold on both sides of the highway, endless and naked, a geography that forgives nothing and hides even less. When the hotel came into view, shimmering like a mirage of good fortune, I almost laughed. It was called the Palisade, though from the outside it looked more like a fortress guarding desperation. At check-in, Mark handled everything. He didn't let me speak. When the clerk asked for an ID, he slid his hand in front of mine. "I've got it," he said, as though I were a confused child or an elderly invalid. I'd never been either. I'd managed payrolls and mortgages and 2 jobs through the 80s. I'd buried a husband, paid off debts, raised him alone after his father's cancer, and kept the house when interest rates climbed like mountains. But in that lobby, under the air-conditioned hum and the gleam of marble, I became invisible. That's the quiet violence of age, not the wrinkles or the aches, but the way people stop addressing you directly, start talking around you, like you're a ghost whose consent doesn't matter. Our rooms were adjoining, though it quickly became clear that family time meant me tagging along where convenient. The first night, they left for dinner with friends. I ate a sandwich from the hotel cafe and watched a game show rerun. I told myself not to take it personally, that they were young, busy, entitled to their fun. But in truth, I knew the pattern. I'd seen it before in subtler forms. The way Mark sighed when I asked him to explain some new app. The way Jasmine introduced me to people as Mark's mom without ever using my name, as if the word Elaine embarrassed her. That weekend, I learned something sharper. Invisibility is not silence. It's erasure disguised as politeness. The next morning, they invited me down to the casino floor, and for a fleeting moment, I felt almost excited. The air buzzed with manufactured hope. The carpet pulsed with colors that looked alive under the neon. Mark bought me a roll of chips and kissed my forehead like he was rewarding a child for good behavior. "Try your luck, Ma," he said. "Just don't get carried away." His tone was joking, but the warning in it was real. He handed me a drink I hadn't asked for, something pink and glittering. "It's fun," Jasmine said. "Makes you feel young." I took a sip. It was sweet and cold, and I thought briefly, maybe this weekend will be different. Maybe this is the moment we remember each other kindly. For the next hour, I sat at a penny slot, feeding coins into a mouth that never filled. The machine blinked and chirped and rewarded me with small noises that sounded like applause. Mark hovered nearby for a while, then drifted toward the blackjack tables, drawn by the gravity of real risk. I could see him across the room, shoulders squared, that familiar hunger lighting his face, the same one he used to wear when he wanted me to say yes to something that wasn't good for him. I watched him bet, lose, laugh too loudly, then win and stand taller. Jasmine disappeared somewhere between her third drink and his second round of luck. I think she went shopping. Women like her always flee when the performance stops. When I finally stood up, my knees stiff, my purse lighter, I walked toward his table. He was surrounded by noise, men clapping, women laughing, the smell of alcohol and adrenaline hanging thick. I waited at the edge of it, not wanting to intrude, but he saw me and waved me closer with a grin that was more command than welcome. "Come on, Mom, bring me some of that good luck." I smiled, stepped into the circle of light, and felt every eye glance over me. The old woman in a green blouse, polite, fragile, out of place. I placed one small chip on the felt. The dealer nodded. Mark watched. I won the hand, by accident, by instinct, by some cosmic joke. And that's when he said it, too loud, too sharp, each word slicing through the shallow laughter of strangers. "She'll lose even her clothes." Time paused. The dealer's hands froze midair. Someone at the next table snorted uncomfortably. Mark laughed again, a jagged, ugly sound, and slapped the table. "What? It's a joke. She's always been lucky till it costs someone else." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I didn't flinch. There's an art to surviving public humiliation. You have to make stillness your dignity. I looked at the dealer, nodded once, and whispered, "Hit me." My voice didn't shake. My son did, though. He wasn't expecting me to stay in the game. He wasn't expecting me to still have any. I can't tell you exactly what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage or sorrow. It was recognition. I saw the man he had become and the woman I had been, always holding, forgiving, covering, explaining. And I knew that something irreversible had happened, something small and seismic. The floor lights shimmered, the card slid toward me, and for the first time in decades, I didn't think about how to make anyone else comfortable. I thought only of my own hand, my own chance, my own pulse. That was the beginning, though I didn't know it then, the night my son tried to strip me of dignity and instead peeled off his own. Later, people would talk about what happened next, how he raised his voice, how security had to step in, how Jasmine pretended not to know him. But all I remember is the silence between one heartbeat and the next, when I realized that losing isn't always the worst outcome. Sometimes it's how you finally stop playing someone else's game. When security took him away, I didn't follow. The crowd parted like a slow tide, murmuring in that half-ashamed, half-thrilled way people do when cruelty entertains them. I could hear the clatter of his protest trailing off down the corridor, that familiar childish pitch of injustice, the tone he'd used at 6 when I told him we couldn't afford new sneakers, the tone that somehow survived adulthood. I stayed at the table, my hands resting on the felt, the cards cooling in front of me, the dealer asking softly if I wished to continue. I nodded, not because I cared about the game, but because I couldn't bear the walk back to my room yet. I played one more round, lost quietly, tipped the dealer, and gathered my things. The casino's air was heavy with recycled oxygen and other people's desperation. I could almost taste it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the lights seemed brighter after humiliation, like pain sharpens the world's edges. At the elevator, Jasmine appeared. Her lipstick was smudged, her pupils glassy. She looked at me as though I were a problem that had escaped its corner. "They said he'll be released once he sobers up," she murmured, voice rehearsed, tone flat. "He just had too much to drink. You know how he gets." I wanted to tell her that I did know, not just how he got, but how he became, that I'd watched the sweetness of a boy erode under the acid of entitlement, how every kindness I gave became the soil for his arrogance to grow in. But I said nothing. I only nodded and pressed the elevator button. She followed me in, scrolling through her phone, pretending to be absorbed by something urgent. When the doors closed, the mirrored walls reflected us back at ourselves, her youth, sleek and gleaming, and my face, the map of everything I'd endured. We stood like that in silence until the doors opened to the floor we shared. In the hallway, she stopped me with a sigh that sounded more like annoyance than apology. "He didn't mean it," she said finally. "That comment. He's just stressed. You know, work, the kids, the pressure of everything. He lashes out sometimes." I turned to her slowly and smiled the way you do when you finally stopped pretending you don't see what's in front of you. "He meant it," I said. Her face flickered. Not guilt, not compassion, just discomfort at the honesty. Then she shrugged. "Maybe," she admitted. "Anyway, it's done now. Let's just get through the weekend." I unlocked my door without replying and stepped inside, leaving her in the hallway, her perfume lingering like a question that no longer needed an answer. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the reflection of the city in the window. Reno at night is a cruel mirror, beautiful from a distance, merciless up close. I could see the blue glow of the signs, the slow crawl of headlights along the strip, the small figures moving through light like moths chasing warmth. I felt very old, but not in the way of years. It was a weariness of having spent a lifetime misunderstanding what love required. I had confused loyalty for virtue, silence for patience, forgiveness for strength. Every time I thought I was giving him a foundation, I was actually giving him permission. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. It was from the hotel manager, polite handwriting, informing me that the room balance had been transferred to my account because the primary guest's payment method had been declined. It was a small sum, $420, but it told the whole story. Mark's credit cards had always been a performance of prosperity, each one maxed out and replaced before it could expose the truth. I paid the bill without hesitation. The money didn't matter as much as what it revealed. I was still the safety net he assumed would never tear. When the cashier returned my receipt, she looked at me with that mixture of pity and respect reserved for women who have clearly lived through too much and survived anyway. I smiled at her, and for the first time in a long while, the smile was genuine. Later that day, I went to the hospital to collect him. The staff had called to say he was awake, embarrassed, sober enough to be discharged. Jasmine didn't come. She'd needed space. When I entered the waiting room, he was sitting hunched over, elbows on knees, eyes on the floor. He looked smaller, as if the performance had been peeled away, and all that remained was a man made of resentment and regret. "Mom," he said, barely looking up. I handed him his jacket. He smelled of whiskey and something sour beneath it. Failure, maybe. "You okay?" I asked, the words automatic, habitual. He nodded. "I'm sorry about last night," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I waited, but no further words came. Not I shouldn't have said that. Not you didn't deserve it. Just that thin apology that cost him nothing. On the way back to the hotel, he talked about everything except what mattered, about his job, the stress, how Jasmine was difficult. He told me that I should stop worrying, that he'd take care of everything, that we'd laugh about it one day. His voice was manic with control, the same false confidence he used to charm investors and silence doubt. I nodded at the right moments. I'd spent my life being his audience, but something had shifted, subtle as the movement of a tide beneath still water. I was listening, yes, but not to him. I was listening to the part of me that had been quiet for too long, the voice that once said, "You deserve peace," before I learned to drown it in service. That evening, when he left to meet a client, I knew it was a lie. He always used work as a disguise for escape. I stayed in the room, the television humming low, the city's glow pulsing through the curtains. I thought about leaving, not the room, not the hotel, but the whole orbit of his world. The thought came softly, without drama, like a door unlocking. I imagined packing my bag, calling a cab, going anywhere that wasn't shaped by his voice. And then I imagined something stranger, not calling anyone to tell them, just going. Around midnight, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Jasmine again, her mascara faintly smeared, her voice trembling with that brittle brightness women use when they're close to breaking. "He's downstairs," she said, "gambling again. I tried to stop him, but he told me to mind my own business." She laughed, a small hysterical sound. "He's losing everything. Maybe you can talk to him." I looked at her for a long time, this woman who had mistaken survival for strategy, who had built her life around managing his moods. I almost pitied her. Then I picked up my purse and followed her to the elevator. On the casino floor, I spotted him easily. He was standing at the roulette table, a small crowd around him, his gestures exaggerated, his laugh too loud. He looked nothing like a man in control. He looked like a boy trying to win back the right to be seen. When he noticed me, his smile faltered. "Mom," he said too brightly, "come to bring me luck again?" I shook my head. "No, Mark. I came to say you don't need my luck. You've already used it all. The dealer spun the wheel. The crowd watched. He placed a final bet, red, all in. It landed on black. For a second, he didn't move. Then he laughed, that same hollow sound, and swept his empty hands across the table. Guess that's it, he said, and turned away. Jasmine started crying quietly. I stood there, still and strange, feeling nothing but clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is an energy. It keeps you tethered. I felt released, hollow and light, like a balloon finally cut from a child's grip. He stumbled past me toward the exit, muttering something about needing air. The doorman called after him, but he didn't stop. He disappeared into the night, half drunk, half naked in spirit, stripped of everything he thought he controlled. I went back to the table. The dealer looked at me uncertainly, waiting for some sign, maybe a command. 1 chip, I said. My voice didn't tremble. I placed it on a random number, watched the wheel spin, heard the tiny rattle of destiny disguised as chance. The ball landed, red this time. I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I finally understood what the win was. It wasn't money, not pride, not even revenge. It was agency, the quiet reclaiming of self after a lifetime of being currency in someone else's game. When I left the casino that night, the air was cool, and the city lights no longer looked cruel. They looked honest, artificial, yes, but unapologetically so. I walked back to the hotel alone, slower than usual, each step deliberate, the click of my shoes on the pavement syncing with the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. For the first time in years, the sound belonged only to me. In the days that followed his outburst, nothing exploded, nothing obvious broke, and that was somehow worse, because the humiliations returned to their ordinary disguises, small and careful as moths chewing through a sweater in the dark, so that when I woke each morning in the narrow hotel bed with the patterned carpet moving like water beneath my feet, I felt a little thinner and a little more see-through, and still expected to say thank you for the privilege. Mark eased back into charm, like a salesman changing jackets, making a point to swing by my room with a paper cup of coffee that tasted faintly of burnt almonds, an apology, telling me he had set up a player's card in my name to maximize benefits for the family, which meant, of course, points that fed his own appetite, complimentary drinks that fed his carelessness, and a plastic smile from every clerk who now addressed me as Mrs. H, as if it were intimacy rather than shorthand for the pocket they could reach. He said we'd do a buffet brunch on him, and at the hostess stand, I watched him angle the card toward the scanner with the swagger of a man buying a kingdom, only to turn and ask me if I had small bills for the tip, because he was cashless, and I handed them over. Of course I did, because mothers are trained piggy banks with soft voices and unbreakable hinges. And when Jasmine dabbed at her lipstick in the mirrored pillar and told me the salmon looked a bit challenging for your age, I smiled and reached for eggs I didn't want, so I wouldn't have to see my reflection beside hers. I tried to tell myself that these were ordinary irritations, that families bump and scrape like boats tied too close to a cheap dock, but even ordinary hurts collect interest, and I had been paying his interest for years, with my savings and my patience and the careful trimming of my presents to the smallest possible size. And now the trimming continued with professional grace. When I went back to my room after brunch, the key card blinked red and the door wouldn't yield. And when I walked to the desk with that particular mixture of dignity and weary humor older women put on when asking for help, the clerk informed me politely that the primary guest had adjusted the reservation to consolidate accounts, which meant my room had been reassigned, and my suitcase placed in a locked storage room for convenience. And before I could decide whether to laugh or cry, Mark appeared with a breezy explanation about how we'd be closer now, how his room had 2 queens, how it made sense to keep us together, and he said it as if tenderness, not control, had motivated him. And I nodded, because arguing in lobbies only stains the person who still believes they can be heard. That afternoon, I discovered another small subtraction. The cash envelope I'd tucked beneath my sweater in the drawer, my emergency money, was lighter by exactly 2 crisp hundreds, the rubber band retied with clumsy innocence, and when I looked up from the drawer, Mark was in the bathroom humming, the shower running, the mirror already clouding over with steam that smelled of eucalyptus and a lie. And I stood there with the drawer open, and my hands steadied like a nurse about to thread a needle in a moving car, and I closed it slowly and told myself perhaps I had miscounted, because women my age are encouraged to doubt the arithmetic of their own lives. But I knew the weight of that envelope, the way you know the weight of an infant you've carried for hours. You can feel the difference, even if no one else does. In the evening, he announced we'd go low stakes for Mom, and pressed a handful of chips into my palm with that theatrical flourish generosity wears when it expects applause. And then, as I played the gentlest of slot machines, I felt his hand drift over my shoulder to borrow back a few for a hot streak at the craps table, and the heat of his breath on my hair was not intimacy. It was a draft from a door left open for too long. Jasmine's kindness arrived the way rain does in desert films, brief, cinematic, gone by the wide shot. She looped her arm through mine on the walkway between towers and told me she loved that I still made an effort, which is the kind of compliment that is also a subtraction if you listen closely. And then she asked if I could watch her tote while she ran to the boutique for a return, which turned out to be an exchange for something shinier and louder, and I sat on a bench under a fake palm tree for 45 minutes, guarding a bag as if it were a life, while tourist fountains danced to a recorded opera, and a boy in an oversized hoodie tried to teach his grandmother how to use the camera on her phone, and I thought of all the things I had guarded for Mark, grades and reputations and secrets and overdrafts, and how guarding becomes a posture you forget how to put down, so that even when no one is asking, you keep your hands clasped and your mouth closed and your eyes on the door. At night, I lay awake listening to the casino's heartbeat rise and fall through the window, and sometimes to Mark's restless speech as he traded calls with people who were always on the verge of making him whole, and sometimes to the hotel's plumbing sigh, a sound like old men agreeing that nothing changes, and sometimes to the small animal sound the soul makes when it realizes it has been living for years in a house whose rules were written by someone else. And in those hours, I practiced the graceful movements of complicity. I told him he looked handsome when he shaved. I told Jasmine the glitter on her eyelids made her eyes even brighter. I told the valet thank you, as if I had the power to tip what I should. And when Mark asked whether I could spot him a little because a transfer was taking too long, I opened my purse and took out bills as if I were untying a ribbon on a gift he had earned. The escalations were quiet as dust. One morning at breakfast, he ordered for me without asking, the soft scramble and dry toast, a kind of edible shushing. When I mentioned my feet were swelling, he waved a hand and suggested I sit by the penny slots while he and Jasmine handled the real action, the words spoken with the affectionate dismissal you give to a toddler offered a plastic steering wheel. In the gift shop, he pointed at a visor and said how cute it would look on me, the way you put a costume on a supporting character so the audience doesn't mistake her for someone with a plot. Later, he took a call in the hallway and, believing I was out of earshot, told someone that bringing me had been a tax write-off of patience and that I was doing surprisingly well for her age. And the laugh that followed was a threadbare blanket he pulled over his embarrassment about who he was when I reflected him too clearly. I responded, as trained, with quiet improvements to everyone else's comfort. I learned where Jasmine liked to stand for photographs, so her collarbones looked like fragile instruments that might play a pure note if touched by the right man. I noticed which bartender poured Mark a heavier hand when he used the word buddy. I timed my bathroom trips to coincide with their bursts of affection so I wouldn't be a witness they had to perform for. I folded the small bed throw into a neat square each morning because I cannot stop making order where I find it. And that is both a gift and a curse when other people's chaos is curated to look like a lifestyle. But even as I cooperated, something else kept happening, timid and stubborn as a sprout, pushing through hard ground. It began at a quiet blackjack table far from the noise, where the felt was slightly worn, and the dealer's smile looked like something she took off when she clocked out. And there sat an older man with a posture like good handwriting, counting under his breath not to cheat, but to stay present in his body. And I watched his hands move, how he didn't panic when he lost, how he took a breath before every small decision, how his chips lived in little cairns like trail markers, reminding him the path existed even when the room blurred with neon. On the second day, I stood behind his chair for the length of a coffee, and then for the length of a silence. And on the third day, he turned and said, in the voice of someone who has outlived performance, that beginners make their best mistakes when they rush. And if I wanted to learn anything beyond superstition, I should sit long enough to tell the difference between hunger and a hunch. And I heard in that sentence the outline of a life I had not allowed myself to live. Back upstairs, the details continued their slow theft. A housekeeper apologized that housekeeping had been paused on the floor because of a guest incident, which I knew was code for my son's invisible wake. Jasmine, between sips of something green, told me she had booked a spa appointment for the three of us, then added, almost as an afterthought, that she hoped I wouldn't mind if she and Mark took the couple's room while I tried the salt lounge alone. A text dinged on Mark's phone while he slept, and because God gave me the reflexes of a mother, I turned it face down without reading, but the preview had already flashed a half sentence about funds that were not forthcoming, and I understood the shape of his danger even if I did not know its exact contour, and in understanding it, I recognized the older danger in myself, the one that believes rescue is proof of love. So I began my own small, unannounced rituals. I woke before dawn and walked the corridor where the carpet swallowed footsteps and the mirrors staged a quiet rebellion against the person they were expected to reflect. I carried a tiny spiral notebook from the gift shop and wrote down the rules of blackjack in a neat schoolbook hand, not as an oath to gamble, but as a way to loan myself attention. I bought a plain white blouse at the boutique on clearance, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to wear something without anyone's opinion stitched into it. I practiced saying no in the elevator when no one was there, letting the word fill the carriage like a new fragrance that didn't care to be liked. I took the long way to the cashier cage and watched the morning custodians polish the edges of other people's mess. And I thought how many decades I had held a rag to the stain of someone else's evening and called it motherhood. On the last night before my certainty changed its temperature from warm idea to bright fact, Mark pressed my player's card into my hand with a theatrical sigh and told me to swipe for him at the kiosk because Mom always brings the magic, And when I did, a small voucher printed out with promotional chips that could not be transferred, and he rolled his eyes and told me to go burn them on something cheerful, like giving a child tokens at a cheap arcade. But I did not walk to the nearest flashing promise. I went instead to the quiet table, to the dealer who took off her smile when the floor manager wasn't looking, to the man with the good handwriting spine, and I stood there with the voucher growing warm in my hand, listening to the soft percussion of decisions that belonged to the people making them. And I realized the first escalation was not his cruelty, but my agreement, repeated and refined, to pretend that the smallest version of me was the safest. And once I saw that clearly, the lights stopped glittering like sirens and began to steady like lamps along a road I had forgotten I knew how to walk. That night, I did not sleep, but it wasn't the restless insomnia that comes from noise or caffeine. It was a quieter, more deliberate kind of wakefulness, the body refusing to shut down because it senses that something inside it is rearranging, as though all the drawers that had been neatly packed with obedience were sliding open and spilling their contents onto the floor of my mind. I lay on the narrow hotel bed with my eyes half open, watching the curtains pulse with the flickering light from the casino sign across the street. The neon colors bled through the fabric like strange weather, red and blue and gold, turning my room into a slow-moving storm of artificial dawns. Somewhere below me, a vacuum cleaner hummed, and in the corridor, a pair of lovers argued in whispers, their anger almost tender in its rhythm. It occurred to me that I had spent my whole life listening to other people's noise and mistaking it for evidence that I was part of something alive. By 5 a.m, I got up, washed my face, and decided to walk. The casino lobby was half deserted at that hour, the night gamblers retreating like tidewater, the morning crew moving in with their carts and tired smiles. I nodded at a young janitor who looked surprised to see someone my age awake at that hour, and for a moment I felt both invisible and impossibly seen. I passed the tables that only hours ago had felt like theaters of humiliation, and now they were stripped bare, green felt under harsh lights, nothing glamorous left, only residue, empty glasses, a dropped chip, a smudge of lipstick on the edge of a napkin. It was a stage after the curtain call, honesty revealed in its quiet mess. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, smelling faintly of gasoline and sage. I walked without a destination, only a rhythm, letting the city rearrange itself around my footsteps. Reno, in the early hours, is not the glossy animal it pretends to be. It's a series of back doors and loading docks, the real skeleton behind the flashing grin. I saw cooks smoking behind diners, a woman sweeping the front of a pawn shop, a man sleeping under a billboard that promised winners every hour. They looked at me the way people look at a ghost who doesn't know she's dead yet. I smiled at one of them, an old woman feeding pigeons from a bag of breadcrumbs, and she nodded, like we were members of the same quiet tribe of survivors who had stopped asking for permission to exist. When I returned to the hotel, the front desk clerk handed me a folded printout with my name on it. "This was left for you," she said, eyes soft, with something that might have been pity. Inside was a note from Mark, written in his impatient, slightly arrogant handwriting. "Went to Tahoe for the day. Jasmine needs a break. You'll be fine on your own, right?" The question mark wasn't concern. It was punctuation to a statement he assumed was already answered. I laughed softly. The sound startled me. It had been so long since laughter came from recognition rather than restraint. I went upstairs, packed my things, and placed the room key on the desk. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was the most reasonable thing I'd done in decades. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I remembered that the man at the quiet blackjack table, Arthur, I had learned his name from the dealer, had mentioned that his wife used to work in a diner a few miles down the highway, the kind of place that still served real coffee and not the brown water the hotel called breakfast. It wasn't a plan exactly, but it was a direction, and sometimes that's enough to begin. I checked out, paid my bill in cash, and walked to the bus stop, my small suitcase rolling behind me with the calm clatter of something that no longer feels heavy because it finally belongs to its carrier. The bus was half empty, filled with people going nowhere glamorous. A mother with a sleeping child, a construction worker eating a sandwich, a woman in a bright pink coat talking softly to herself. I sat near the window, pressed my hand against the glass, and watched the city slip away. Each block felt like a layer peeling off, the neon, the noise, the history of who I had been in that place. When the bus turned toward the outskirts, I caught my reflection in the window. Tired, yes, but also unburdened, like someone who had quietly escaped a house that was burning without raising the alarm. The diner appeared just as Arthur had described it, a squat, square building with a flickering sign that read Bluebird Cafe, the paint peeling, but the windows clean. I went in, the bell over the door announcing me with a cheerful sound that didn't match my nerves. The woman behind the counter looked up, mid-pour, and smiled. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded, sat at the far end, and let the warmth of the mug settle into my hands like an old friend. The first sip nearly undid me. It was strong and imperfect, and tasted exactly like the mornings of my younger life, the ones before Mark's demands and Derek's illness, and the years of working late just to keep everything from collapsing. For a moment, I could almost see that woman again, the one who had opinions and energy and laughter that didn't sound like apology. Arthur came in about 20 minutes later, wearing the same gray jacket and that expression of quiet concentration that made him look as if he were perpetually solving some invisible equation. He saw me and stopped, surprised, but not alarmed. "You found the coffee," he said. I smiled. "You were right about it." He sat down across from me, nodding at the waitress for another mug. We didn't talk about the casino or the night or my son. Instead, we talked about the weather, the mountains, the way mornings in Nevada smell like iron and frost. It was the easiest conversation I'd had in years because it asked for nothing and offered nothing except presence. When he left, he tipped generously and said, "If you stay long enough, they start refilling without asking." I stayed until afternoon, then rented a small room in a nearby motel, the kind of place built for people passing through, but never quite leaving. The clerk didn't ask questions. He just handed me a key and wished me luck. The room smelled of bleach and old carpet, and the bedspread was patterned with small, defiant flowers. I unpacked my suitcase, folded my clothes, lined up my toiletries on the narrow sink, and sat on the bed, breathing in the quiet. It was not peace yet, but it was a beginning. That evening, I walked back to the diner for dinner. The waitress greeted me by name. I must have told her without realizing it that morning. She served me stew and bread and asked if I wanted dessert on the house. I declined, but she brought pie anyway. "You look like someone who needs something sweet," she said, and for once, I didn't argue. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, and thought of all the meals I had rushed through, all the times I had eaten standing over a sink because someone else needed the table. I realized that self-forgetting had become my rhythm, and I no longer wanted that music in my life. When I returned to the motel, the phone in the room was blinking. One message, Mark's voice, slurred again, soft but sharp. "Mom, where the hell did you go? Jasmine's furious. You can't just disappear like that. You're scaring people. Call me back." The words were supposed to sound concerned, but underneath them was the old rhythm of command. I erased the message. I didn't even listen to the rest. I unplugged the phone, drew the curtain, and lay down. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt sacred. In the middle of the night, I dreamed of numbers, cards and coins, and the slow click of a roulette wheel, turning not for chance, but for choice. I woke with a sentence in my head: "If you're still waiting for permission, you'll wait forever." I wrote it on the motel notepad and underlined it twice. Morning came gray and windless. I made coffee in the tiny pot by the sink and watched steam rise like a small ceremony. Then I put on my green blouse, brushed my hair, and decided to walk back to the casino, not to see Mark, not even to play, but to see if I could stand in that same place without shaking. The casino smelled different that morning, less perfume, more cleaning fluid. I walked past the tables, past the loud machines, to the quiet corner where Arthur had sat. The seat was empty. I placed one chip on the felt, not to win, but to witness myself doing it. The dealer nodded, dealt the cards, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a participant in someone else's performance. I was simply a woman at a table, choosing. When I left, I cashed out what I'd won, $35, and walked out into the sunlight. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That was the midpoint of my story, though I didn't yet know to call it that. The shift wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no applause, just a quiet realignment, the axis of my life tilting toward myself for the first time in decades. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was direction, and direction, I had learned, can save a person more effectively than any promise of love. As I walked back toward the motel, the wind picked up, carrying the dry scent of sage and dust, and I felt something open in my chest. Not joy, not even hope exactly, but space. Space enough to breathe, and maybe, if I was careful, to begin. The message came 3 days later, not by phone this time, but in the form of a knock at the motel door, just after dusk, that uncertain hour when the sky bruises itself purple and the air smells faintly of metal, when you could almost believe that past mistakes walk the streets looking for their owners. I knew the rhythm of that knock even before I opened it, knew the shape of the silence that followed, the pause of someone deciding how much contrition to rehearse before speaking. I stood still, hand on the knob, long enough to imagine ignoring it, long enough to feel the tremor of temptation that comes with every decision to stay gone. Then I turned it, and there he was, Mark, wearing the same gray jacket I had bought him for a job interview 15 years ago, though the lining now bulged with fatigue and the collar was stiff with neglect. He looked both older and younger than I remembered, older in the eyes, younger in the way guilt can make a man regress to the version of himself who first learned that tears could buy forgiveness. Behind him, parked crookedly, was a rented sedan that bore the smell of cigarettes and panic. "Mom," he said, as if the word were a spell that could reopen every door. "You scared me. Why didn't you tell anyone where you went?" His voice was softer than usual, worn out from the effort of pretending not to be afraid. I stepped aside without meaning to, and he entered the small room like a man invading his own memory. The space seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with his familiar restlessness, that hum of energy that had once impressed teachers and bosses, but now just unsettled furniture. He looked around, saw the neatly folded clothes, the clean coffee cup, the order that had begun to form in the absence of his chaos, and said with half a laugh, "You always make any place look like a catalog picture." It was meant as affection, but it carried the old edge, the one that said my neatness was my consolation prize for not being powerful. I didn't answer. I watched him pace, watched the rhythm of his fingers tapping against his thigh like they used to when he was a boy, waiting for permission to confess. After a minute, he sat down on the bed, rubbing his face with both hands. "Jasmine left," he said. "She took the card, the car, everything. I don't know where she went. She said she couldn't watch me destroy myself, that I was turning into someone she didn't recognize." He looked up at me, searching my face for softness, for the reflex of maternal rescue that had always been there. "You know how dramatic she gets," he added quickly, trying to turn his shame into humor, but the laugh failed halfway. "I just need a few days to get back on my feet. Maybe stay here? I'll find something steady soon, I promise." He said it like a script, every syllable polished by repetition. I had heard versions of it my entire adult life. After the first divorce, after the failed investment, after the borrowed money that never returned. Each time I had believed him because belief felt like love and doubt felt like betrayal. But sitting there in that small motel room with the sound of cars passing outside and the smell of dust rising from the carpet, I realized that belief had become my most expensive addiction. "You can stay tonight," I said finally, "but I'm not your bank, Mark, and I'm not your witness anymore." He blinked, confused, then nodded too quickly, mistaking my restraint for consent. We ate at the diner that evening. Arthur wasn't there, though I found myself looking for him, perhaps because his absence reminded me that kindness could exist without cost. Mark picked at his food, talking between bites about plans and opportunities, each one more desperate than the last. A friend who owed him a favor, a real estate project that only needed a bit of seed money, an investor who had gone quiet for now but might come through. His words were restless birds flying in circles, all sound and no direction. I listened, not as I used to, not with the aching wish to make things better, but with the detached attention of someone observing a performance they once starred in and have now outgrown. When he finished his meal, he reached for the check automatically, then paused as if waiting for me to slide it toward myself. I didn't. The waitress came, he hesitated, and I watched the small muscles of pride tighten and release in his jaw before he muttered, "I'll get it later." I paid, left the tip in cash, and walked out without comment. Back in the motel, the silence stretched between us like an unmade bed. He sat by the window, smoking a cigarette he must have bought with his last few dollars, blowing the smoke toward the cracked glass. "You hate me, don't you?" he said suddenly, not looking at me. The question was old, worn thin by use, but I answered it anyway. "I don't hate you," I said. "I just stopped believing the version of you that you keep selling." He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You think I don't see it? The way you look at me now, like I'm one of those drunks you used to cross the street to avoid." I stood up, poured myself a glass of water from the tap, and said quietly, "No, Mark. I look at you like a man I used to think I could save." He turned, eyes sharp with something between anger and hurt. "I never asked you to save me." I met his gaze, steady. "You didn't have to. You built your life expecting it." The words landed between us like a small explosion, muffled but final. He looked away, crushed the cigarette in the ashtray, and said nothing for a long time. Outside, The motel sign buzzed, one light flickering as though the night itself were unsure whether to stay illuminated. The next day, he was gone when I woke, but his suitcase remained. On the nightstand, a note. Back soon, don't worry, working on something big. The same handwriting, the same rhythm of hope inflated to hide desperation. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the morning unfold. Around noon, the motel clerk knocked, holding out an envelope. "Delivery for you," he said. Inside was a printed receipt from the casino downtown. Mark had withdrawn several $1,000s using my name, forged signature and all, attached to the player's card I'd left behind. My stomach tightened, not with surprise, but with the dull recognition of a pattern finally showing its full shape. I went to the casino, the same one where humiliation had first cracked open something essential in me. The manager met me with polite skepticism, a corporate smile balanced perfectly between apology and accusation. "It happens," he said when I showed him the receipt. "Family members sometimes get confused about ownership." He asked if I wanted to file a claim. I said yes, my voice calm, even, detached. As he filled out the forms, he glanced at me curiously. "You don't seem angry," he said. I thought about that for a moment. "I've been angry for 40 years, I said. It never helped. When I returned to the motel, Mark was waiting outside, pacing, his hair damp from stress. "Mom, you went there, didn't you?" he said before I could speak. "You made a scene." His tone was half accusation, half plea. "Do you have any idea what that does to me? They'll ban me now. You've ruined everything." I stared at him, incredulous. "You stole from me." He threw his hands up, incredulous. "It wasn't stealing. It's just temporary. You think I don't plan to pay you back?" His voice rose, echoing against the concrete. A couple walking by slowed their pace, curious, then hurried away. "I told you," he went on, "I was working on something that could change everything for us." "For us?" I said, and the words came out colder than I expected. "There's no us in your sentences, Mark. There never has been." He stepped closer, his face red, his breath sour with the remnants of cheap liquor. "You think you're better than me now?" he said. "Living in this dump, playing saint to a world that doesn't care?" I didn't move. "No," I said quietly. "I just stopped pretending I was smaller than I am." He blinked, confused by the calm, because rage had always been his weapon, and now it had nowhere to land. He left that evening, slamming the door so hard the mirror rattled. I sat down and waited, but not for him. I was waiting for the old panic that used to follow every rupture, the one that whispered, "Fix it, smooth it, make it safe again." It didn't come. Instead, there was a slow exhale, the body recognizing that it had finally stopped flinching. 2 days later, the call came from the casino. They had caught him trying to cash in counterfeit chips. Security footage showed him shouting, tearing off his jacket, claiming he was owed something. "Do you want to press charges?" the voice asked. I hesitated. The old reflex stirred, the mother who protects even at her own expense, but I let it pass. "No," I said finally. "Just keep him out." The woman on the line sighed, relieved. "That's usually best," she said. That night, I walked to the river that runs behind the motel, the water thin and fast under the weak moon. The air smelled of sage and dust and something faintly metallic. I thought about all the years I had spent mistaking endurance for virtue, about how women like me are taught to survive everything except freedom. I took the last of the counterfeit chips the police had returned as evidence, small, bright lies disguised as value, and dropped them into the river one by one. They sank without sound, vanishing into the current. The next morning, I woke early, opened the window, and felt the cool air move through the room. I made coffee, wrote a single line in my notebook. When you stop rescuing the drowning, you realize how long you've been underwater yourself. I closed it, packed my bag, and walked to the diner. Arthur was there this time, reading a newspaper. He looked up, smiled. "You look lighter," he said. I sat down across from him, nodded, and for the first time in years, the word yes felt like an answer to myself rather than an agreement to someone else. I had always believed that climaxes belonged to younger lives, that the grand reversals and public reckonings arrived when the body could still sprint and the throat could still shout itself hoarse. But the day it happened came on quietly like weather that refuses to be dramatic. A pale morning with a thin wind and a sun that seemed undecided, and I woke with the sense that I had run out of rooms to pace and out of explanations to fold and refold until they looked like mercy. So I dressed in the plain white blouse I had bought on clearance, slid the spiral notebook into my bag as if I were going to school for the first time, and walked toward the Strip with the deliberate, steady gait of someone who knows that her feet are voting. The casino had that between-hours light, not quite night, not yet noon, the housekeepers finishing their quiet choreography, while dealers took their places with faces that could pass for kindness at a distance. And when the guard waved me through, he did not know he was waving me past the last border I had drawn against myself, because I had come not to watch Mark's orbit, not to rehearse endurance, but to end something that had taken decades to name. I went straight to the cashier cage and asked for a new player account in my full name with a hard reset on permissions. And while the clerk typed, the keys clicking like little hammers spelling out a sentence I had postponed, I felt the old compliance rise in my throat and then settle back down like a bird finally finding the right branch. She asked if I wanted to add an emergency contact, and I said no. I would prefer to be the person who answers for me. And when she slid the card under the glass, it felt absurdly light for the weight it shifted. I had planned to sit at the quiet table, the one where the felt showed its age and the dealer's smile had edges, to take a single hand with a single chip and then leave with the simple relief of having stood where I once shook. But fate, or some less mystical cousin of it, prefers mess. And as I crossed the floor, I heard my name spoken in a voice that still thought it could claim me. And there he was again, summoned by the gravity of his own undoing, hair uncombed, shirt untucked, eyes glassy with the sleepless bravado that makes men believe apologies are negotiations. And he said, "Mom, wait," like a command wrapped in concern. And I did not wait because I have learned that hesitation is where I lose myself. So I kept moving, and he followed with the shambling determination of someone who senses the final door closing. At the pit, a floor manager I recognized from other nights, square-shouldered, expensive watch, empathy outsourced to policy, stepped between us and asked if there was a problem, and Mark, smelling of coffee and defeat, announced to anyone who would listen that the house owed him, that the previous incident had been a misunderstanding, that he had only tried to cash what was rightfully his, and as he spoke, he began to climb the rungs of his favorite ladder, from grievance to spectacle, from spectacle to grievance again, and I watched him as I might watch weather through glass, knowing it could not wet me unless I opened the window. Security appeared the way rain appears in a well-rehearsed city, quietly, from several directions at once, and their hands were firm without being cruel. But the moment their fingers touched his elbows, he vaulted into the performance he reserves for thresholds, shouting about rights and destiny and the curse of women who don't know how to be grateful. And then, as if humiliation required costume, he pulled at his collar and yanked the shirt over his head, the fabric snapping at the seams, his chest pale under the pit lights, guests stopping mid-step with that half-hungry, half-pitying curiosity crowds always have. And when one guard reached for the belt, he tore it loose himself and kicked off his shoes so that in seconds he was almost naked in the middle of the house that had taken so much of him, yet still refused to clothe his need. And I felt an ache that was not shame and not pride, but something like mourning, not for the man he was, but for the boy I had once lifted out of a bath and wrapped in a towel, whispering that warm promise all mothers whisper, "I will keep you from cold," without understanding that there are kinds of cold no one person can hold back for another. They guided him toward the service corridor, his voice echoing against the polished surfaces with that wild, thin pitch that turns men into warnings. And just as the doors swung, he twisted and looked for me and shouted something I could not hear over the slot machines, and that, in the end, felt like mercy. When the air settled, the floor manager asked if I wished to continue, and I realized that everything that mattered depended on the grammar of my next act, because to leave would be to let the narrative collapse back into rescue and retreat, and to stay would be to write the final sentence in the tense I had not used for myself in years. I sat. The dealer, a woman with careful hands and the kind of eyes that know which stories can be heard and which must simply be witnessed, nodded once, a secular blessing. I placed the smallest bet aloud, felt the polite weight of the chip anchor me to the felt, and told myself that I was not gambling with money, but with habit, staking one unremarkable moment against 40 years of reflex. The hand unfolded with the indifferent elegance cards always have when they are not working as metaphors. A hard 12 against a dealer's 2, the kind of small decision that foreshadows temperament more than fate. Somewhere behind me, a man laughed too loudly. Somewhere above me, a ventilation fan hummed like a distant ocean, and inside me, the old committee, caretaker, accountant, peacemaker, rose to offer counsel, and I thanked them silently for their decades of service and stepped past them to the part of me that had learned to breathe alone. I hit. The next card came like a clean sentence. I stayed. The dealer broke. Small win, small sound, a soft tap as she pushed chips toward me, and I felt an almost unbearable tenderness for that quiet arithmetic of agency. I do not believe the universe keeps ledgers for moments like this, but people do, and the house recognizes attention when it concentrates, and the table settled into that improbable rhythm where the math and the room and the pulse inside the wrist braid themselves into something not mystical, but undeniably coherent, and I played within my limits, never chasing, never crowning luck as virtue, and the stacks grew not monstrously, but steadily, cairns again, modest monuments to a person refusing to flee herself. At some point, the pit boss leaned in and offered to color me up, and when the racks changed from the cheerful mess of low denominations to the quiet authority of blacks, I heard a murmur from the edge of the felt, and one of the dealers from a neighboring table, a young man with a sleeve of roses inked along his forearm, said in that awed whisper people use when they glimpse discipline disguised as ease, that I was on a run. I am not foolish. I know the difference between a run and a life. So when the first wobble arrived, a hand that took too many thoughts to decide, I stood, slid a single chip forward as a totem of gratitude, and asked for the marker to cash out. The cashier's window framed my face like a passport photo to a country I had finally decided to enter. I passed the racks through the slot and watched her count without hurry, her nails squared, her lips moving as if the numbers were a prayer. When she stacked the bills and banded them and wrote a total on the receipt, the amount startled me, not because it was astronomical. It wasn't. I will not pretend I conjured a fairy tale fortune, but because it was clean, enough to replace the rent that had frightened me, enough to pay the lawyer I had decided to hire, enough to prove, if only to myself, that staying seated in one's own name yields a kind of dividend no house can calculate. I asked her for envelopes in 3 sizes. I placed most of the money in the largest and sealed it with the care of someone sending herself a letter she intends to open in emergencies that are not financial. Into the second, smaller one, I slid bills for the month ahead, making each fold a tiny vow. The third, a blue-lined pocket, I left nearly empty on purpose, a decoy for any future panic that might go rifling through my belongings, looking for authority. I did not go straight back to the motel. I walked to a quiet office above a storefront with a sun-faded sign for legal services, the kind of place that handles wills and small disputes and the necessary paperwork that keeps lives from unraveling when people stop pretending civility is enough. And I asked to speak with whoever had a moment for a simple consultation. The woman who saw me couldn't have been more than 35, hair pulled into a practical knot, eyes tired in the way good people's eyes get when they do careful work for clients who arrive late to their own rescue. And I told her the clean version of my story, with the numbers and dates aligned like soldiers who would obey what feelings never could. And she listened without rearranging my sentences. And when I finished, she said we could do 2 things today: file a notarized statement regarding the forged withdrawal to close that corridor, and draft a letter that carried the weight of law rather than guilt. A letter that said no in a dialect that even persistent men learned to recognize. She slid the paper across the desk, and as I read, the prose was dry and mercifully without poetry. Cease and desist, non-consensual use, revocation of access, notice of intent, and in those sterile words, I heard a choir, because sometimes salvation sounds like paperwork. I signed my full name, the hand a little shaky and then steady, and when she asked if I wanted them to be the return address for any future correspondence, I said yes, and felt an invisible anvil roll off my chest and thud harmlessly into a place built to hold it. By late afternoon, the sky had decided itself into blue, and the wind that crossed the parking lot behind the diner carried the clean smell of kitchens resetting, onions and soap, and a little lemon. Arthur was at the counter with a newspaper folded like a sail. He looked up, squinted as though the light had changed around me, and asked if I would like my usual. I told him I would like exactly what today required, which turned out to be coffee that tasted of decisions and a slice of pie I did not justify to anyone. I did not tell him the spectacle I had witnessed, the near nakedness, the corridor of security and shame, because some stories lose power when you make them entertainment, and what mattered had nothing to do with the crowd's memory. I told him instead that I had finally hired language to do work my heart could not, and he nodded with the precise gravity of a man who understands that legal pads can be rafts. When I returned to the motel, the message light on the desk phone blinked with its frantic red eye, and for a second, the old muscle memory twitched, the one that would pick up and absorb the shouting before it could bruise the air. But I let it blink, let it tire itself out, and instead, I opened the largest envelope and counted the bills again, not because I doubted the arithmetic, but because the physical fact of enough is a medicine that needs to be taken slowly the first time, and then I slid the envelope into the hollow behind the closet's loose baseboard where the plaster smells of chalk and the past, and I taped a small note over the seam that read in neat script, "Cleaning schedule," so that even I would have to pause and smile before reaching for it. I sat on the bed, wrote 3 final sentences on my notebook page, one to the manager who had helped me file the claim, one to the lawyer confirming our next appointment, and one to myself that said plainly that the story had turned and would not turn back. And then I lay down in my clothes and closed my eyes. The room's thin walls offered their usual chorus: television laughter next door, pipes clicking awake, a car door thumping shut, and none of it offended me, because under it there was the new silence I had carried in from the casino, the silence that follows a door closing with the correct amount of force. In the morning, I mailed the legal letter, crisp in its envelope with the firm's return address like a shield, and as I slid it into the blue box, I felt an impulse to apologize to the sky for taking so long to arrive at myself. And then I laughed, low and long, because the sky does not require apologies from women who stop drowning where no one else can see. I walked home, which is what I had started calling the motel, without embarrassment. And at the corner, a boy on a scooter stopped to let me pass with a theatrical bow, and I bowed back because in this new grammar, even small courtesies feel like a currency I am willing to spend. I made coffee, opened the window, and let the morning enter without permission, and as the steam rose and the city performed its daily theater of survival, I thought of all the things I had believed I needed to win, and how none of them, in the end, were as precious as the right to sit at my own table and not flinch when my name was called. The weeks that followed were neither triumphant nor tragic. They were what I had been secretly craving all along: ordinary, steady, unremarkable days that began and ended on my own terms. It took me a while to understand that calm is not the absence of pain, but the absence of permission for others to rearrange it. I found a small rhythm in the town's muted heartbeat, the kind that would seem invisible to anyone looking for drama, but which, for someone like me, felt like a slow resurrection. Each morning I rose before the noise of traffic began, boiled water, and made my single cup of coffee in the chipped mug the motel owner had let me keep. The steam rose against the window, and through it I watched the city loosen its dreams, delivery trucks reversing, pigeons gathering, the faint shimmer of sunlight breaking over the roofs of the casinos I no longer entered. People began to recognize me, the woman from room 7 who always smiled at the mail carrier, who bought her groceries one bag at a time, who read old paperbacks in the diner corner as if she were waiting for a friend. Sometimes I was waiting, though not for anyone specific. I waited for the part of me that had been exiled for decades, the woman who once laughed too loudly at her own jokes, who painted her nails in deep, foolish colors, who believed that kindness didn't require martyrdom. She returned slowly, like someone testing the temperature of a long-forgotten sea, and I learned to make space for her without apology. Mark called once more, perhaps out of habit or guilt or some blend of both. I didn't recognize his voice at first. It sounded deflated, smaller, stripped of its usual certainty. He said he was in a treatment program somewhere near Sacramento, that he was trying to get clean, that he had read my letter and understood. I didn't ask which letter he meant, the legal one or the invisible one written in silence when I walked away, but I said that I hoped he would take care of himself. He asked if I would come visit, and I told him that perhaps one day I might, but not now. There was no anger in my refusal, only the calm acknowledgement that love, to survive, must sometimes live in separate rooms. He began to cry quietly, and I listened without filling the silence with comfort, because comfort had always been our shared drug, and we were both overdue for withdrawal. Before hanging up, I said, "You have the same chance I had, to stop before the story ends you." Then the line went still, and I knew that whatever came next would not be mine to manage. In late autumn, Arthur knocked on my door, holding a brown paper bag and 2 cups of coffee. He said he was driving to Carson City to visit his daughter and wanted to drop something off before he left. Inside the bag were 2 decks of cards, still sealed, and a note in his careful, looping handwriting that read, "For practice or memory, whichever you prefer." I smiled, thanked him, and told him to drive safely. After he left, I opened one of the decks, spread the cards across the bed, and arranged them in neat lines, red and black, numbers and faces, until they formed something that resembled order, but not obedience. It struck me then how strange and perfect it was that the tool once used to humiliate me had become an instrument of clarity. Life doesn't hand out metaphors kindly. You have to earn them through repetition, through endurance, through staying at the table long enough to know when to stand up. I began writing again, not letters, not diaries, but stories, not about Mark, not even about my marriage or the years of careful silence, but small vignettes about women who lose and win and lose again in ways that no one sees. I wrote them in longhand, on cheap paper, sometimes at the diner, sometimes on the motel's patio, where the wind carried the scent of fried onions and wet concrete. The waitress would bring me coffee and ask what I was working on, and I would tell her I was just recording weather reports from the heart. She would laugh and shake her head and call me the professor, and I would accept the nickname because in a way she was right. I was studying the climate of survival. One evening, as the first frost began to decorate the edges of the windows, I went for a walk by the river. The water had thinned with the season, its voice quieter but still constant. I stood on the footbridge and looked down at the current, remembering how I had dropped the counterfeit chips there weeks before. They would be buried under silt now, indistinguishable from stones, their falseness erased by persistence. The image comforted me. Maybe that was what healing was, not erasing what had happened, but letting time bury its noise until only the shape of endurance remained. Sometimes I still dream of him, not the man who shouted or borrowed or lied, but the boy who once built sandcastles so fragile he would cry when the tide arrived. In those dreams, I don't rescue him. I simply watch the water come and tell him that loss is part of the tide's contract with the shore. I wake with a soft ache, but no guilt. Grief, I've learned, is not the enemy of peace. It's just peace's older sister who remembers the road better. Now, when I pass the casinos, I no longer feel the tug of shame or the thrill of defiance. I see them for what they are, rooms built on the illusion that luck can rearrange what courage must. I carry a small coin in my pocket, one from that last night, not as superstition, but as punctuation, a reminder that every story deserves an ending chosen by its narrator. When I touch it, I remember the sound of the cards, the hum of the machines, the moment I stayed seated instead of walking away, and the stillness that followed when everything I feared had already happened and I was still breathing. I have made my peace with the ordinary. The plants on my windowsill lean toward the weak winter sun. The woman at the laundry asks about my writing. The diner keeps my favorite table open on Thursdays. Sometimes, when another older woman comes in with that lost, careful look, the one that says she has been surviving someone else's gravity for too long. I want to reach across the distance and tell her that she can leave the table, that she can take her winnings, no matter how small, and start a new game where no one deals for her. But I have learned that advice is a fragile gift. It must be offered without the weight of instruction. So I smile, slide my cup toward the waitress, and leave enough tip for someone else to feel briefly lucky. In the evenings, when the air cools and the motel lights buzz with their lonely fluorescence, I sit by the window and read what I've written. The words are clumsy sometimes, uneven, but they belong entirely to me. That is the jackpot I collected, the one no one can gamble away. I write until the letters blur, until the quiet becomes thick and companionable, and then I close the notebook, place it beside the lamp, and whisper to the empty room, "You did it. You stayed until the cards made sense." The room answers only with the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rush of wind outside, but that is enough. I don't know how many more years I have, and for once that ignorance feels like grace. Every morning is its own small spin of the wheel, but now the stakes are different. I play for peace, for laughter, for the slow dignity of not being defined by anyone's pity. And if there is any advice left in me, any final line for another woman sitting alone somewhere with a cup of cooling coffee and a heart heavy from being someone's collateral, it is this: never confuse surrender with serenity. You are allowed to fold the hand that harms you. You are allowed to win quietly. You are allowed, even now, to walk away while the lights are still on.